Hello, and welcome to the Grow Places podcast, where we explore the virtuous circle of people, growth, and place. Brought to you by Grow Places and hosted by our founder, Tom Larsson.
Denz, thanks very much for joining me today on the Grow Places podcast. Having me here at the Foundry, which is a super amazing space, part of incredible development here, and a great starting point probably for our conversation today about activation of places, place making, place growth, people. And so before we jump into it, why don't you give a bit of an intro to yourself?
Of course. Well, thanks for inviting me on to your podcast, Tom. It's really appreciated. So my name's Denz Ibrahim. I am the head of featuring and place for Legal & General. And I also sit on the board of Foundry, which we, as you said, co-founded with Legal & General, co-founded with Adam Walker about 2.5 years ago, as the home of micro enterprise for Legal & General. I do two things, essentially, with those two hats on. So the first thing within the Future Places team within Legal & General, we are essentially a placemaking hub in the heart of the private markets business and real estate equity business of Legal & General. And we essentially look after or are responsible for everything on the ground floor that touches the customer. So it could be reinventing and rethinking town centres, such as shopping centres or retail parks, but it's also about creating and future-proofing neighbourhoods in the heart of our residential communities and the regeneration component of the business. And the Foundry bit is a strong connection to that, which is essentially a co-working business originally. It's a co-working business tapping into creating enterprise space in the heart of underserved communities across the UK. Our first ones being in a storage room in a shopping centre in Eastbourne, a vacant job centre in Poole, and then the last two being in BTR assets, Walthamstow and Wandsworth. But it was all about how do you create space that we have a bit more control over, that we have understanding of how they operate, how our customers behave, but also having the ability to diversify our assets, not just around shopping, but also around working, or it could be healthcare, it could be wellness. So it was a real connection point between, creating a placemaking strategy with Foundry at the heart.
Yeah, amazing. And actually it's quite a nice segue, because the way you ended that was where I was going to go next, which is, I think it's fascinating that, a big investment management entity like Legal & General are also, taking stakes in and becoming operators as well. Because there is often a disconnect sometimes between, you could say, the money and the operations, and integrating that through, I think is fascinating. What we're doing at Truewood Brewery with the owner operator there, they have such a unique perspective because they do actually operate businesses within their own estate, and it gives you that first-hand experience, doesn't it? So, yeah. So maybe, I don't know if there's any sort of things that come to mind when you say, okay, well, maybe your approach, maybe personally or at IM, pre the Foundry and post the Foundry, like, does anything come to mind?
I guess I'll give you the reason why, right? Because, so I joined Legal & General 5 years ago, 5 years ago, originally as head of retail. And my brief was completely reinvent and rethink how we do retail in the business, both culturally, how do we approach shops, streets, and really think about that as an asset management business, but also spatially, how do we future-proof our spaces? And for me, I'm a designer by background, I'm not a real estate guy, so the lens of the customer was really important to the narrative that we created and the philosophy that we created. And that philosophy was based on basically 5 pillars. And I'll come on to the question on why in a minute, but the context being that, the 5 pillars were, 1, being much more customer-centric, so being less of a passive landlord, being much more involved and being agile and responsive to the market, but also to what the customer wants. 2, being much more data-focused and ensuring that we are responsive to what the data is giving us. 3 was about diversification, so diversification of, 1, the mix, but also the revenue streams, so we were de-risking that environment. And then there was a piece around partnership. And the partnership piece was, again, going back to the customer-centric bit, was no longer was it around tenants and landlord, but much more around partnerships. And if we built that rapport and that connection with our occupiers, we had a better chance being much more agile within our environments and our approach. So Foundry as an operational business was part of that DNA, right? Because it's the idea was, if you have a lot more control, you have a lot more agility, you have a lot more ability to respond to the customer, you are responding essentially to where I think retail got a bit lost, or where the ground floor got a bit lost. It all became a bit too samey. It became cookie cutter in environments which had their back to the towns and had their back to existing communities. So having the operational control, having the curatorial ability to deliver the right content to the right people allowed us, as I guess on the backdrop of a pretty traditional landlord, the ability to have a lot more involvement and a lot more proactivity. So Foundry was the catalyst to that, but we also did other products. So we've got a product called Gather, which is our own events program product. So we hire curators in the middle of our shopping centres to curate community events. On average, we have around 1,000 a year that happen. They could be charity events, it could be fashion events, it could be pizza and prosecco, but it's about bringing new types of people to those environments. We also run our own markets, so supporting local community to bring markets in the heart of shopping centres or the heart of retail parks, and soon to be the heart of residential environments. So Foundry is definitely a component to that, but we are having much more involvement in how we curate our environments to ensure they stay relevant.
Yeah, fascinating. And then what are the learnings that come out of that kind of feed back in this sort of loop that I'm assuming you have internally, which is from, top-down investment, value creation, narrative, build out, learnings. How do you see that?
So it's hard to answer that question when you're talking about multiple different environments. So let's think about the residential environment as a pocket, right? Because shopping centres have a different value metric, retail parks, and they're all a slightly different story. But if you start thinking about the why we do this within residential, it goes back to I guess the argument that I make is the biggest risk of real estate is the commoditization of real estate. So the idea that value is a much more holistic value when we talk about this. We don't look at the value as this one shop on the ground floor of residential. We look at the value as an overarching piece. So you have, in this particular environment, in New Acres, in Wandsworth, which is a build-to-rent asset, we have 1,000 flats, 30% affordable, but we've got 50,000 square foot of commercial. So actually, the way we see the commercial playing a part in this isn't the ERV and the rent that we're generating from that one shop. It's what's the vertical value it's giving us? How does it drive retention for our residents upstairs? How does it drive occupancy? How do we make sure that the investment our investors have put in there, we give them a long-term view on that and a long-term investment value piece on that? But then also there's a horizontal value. And that horizontal value is about how do you bring in the existing community. And that's really important when you're building relationships with local authority, with local customers and local people. And it's not this new thing that lands in the middle of this environment. So having much more control of that ground floor and ensuring that you're delivering rents and you're delivering value by turnover deals, by the right mix, by ensuring we have the right social media campaigns, the right programmatic component to the shops and also the public realm, allows us to create a holistic value proposition that is really unique and is connected throughout the whole asset, as opposed to, I guess, the old way of going, okay, there's a box here, we have to fill it with an occupier that wants that style of box. It's going to give us this amount of rent a year, but actually it might not mean anything to the people above, and therefore they can go and live anywhere else and get the same experience. So it has to be seen as connecting the dots, in my view.
Yeah, really interesting. And is that the kind of, would you say that's quite a good description of what you think of as a future place then? It kind of something that if we're in that in terms of maybe a value proposition.
Sure. It has to be completely customer centric. So understanding what the customer wants, what the resident wants, what the community wants, and then therefore curating that and delivering a great place where people want to live, want to work, want to shop, want to play, and that could be numerous different reasons. But the key here is it can't be faddy. It can't be like really good and really relevant today and next year, but actually it falls out of fashion a little bit. And if you think about the customer that we're trying to that we're aiming for, or the customer that I guess engages this type of environment, they are ever more demanding, ever more trend driven, and therefore we have to be agile as landlords. I always talk about this notion that the hardest job for real estate is, especially within retail, is you've got this pretty fixed, inflexible world of property, often driven by spreadsheets in a tower in London, trying to deliver environments to a really nomadic, evolving, ever-changing and ever-demanding customer base. And I guess my job and my team's job is to try and find that equilibrium, trying to find that balance constantly where we are delivering the right kind of value to our investors, to our peers, the peers internally, our fund managers, but also ensuring they create relevant places for the people that are going to use them and the people that are going to live here as well.
Yeah, and then how do you, because some of the examples you mentioned of your 5 existing Foundry and a couple more coming, they're not all just in London, are they? They're in different places across the UK. How has that come about? Has that been something which is led by the BTR strategy, and then you're kind of sort of supporting that, or are you sort of, is the Foundry kind of uncovering neighbourhoods and is kind of splitting as well then the business case for the BTR?
So Foundry is an exclusive product for Legal & General. It was born out of, as I said, tapping into the micro enterprise community, which was historically a community or business that we never tapped into at Legal & General. So having the ability, doing that, 1, 2, also tapping into geographical areas where historically there wasn't these kind of environments in those areas. So underserved communities, underserved enterprise communities. So there's no doubt the first couple were based off of essentially shopping centres, us trying to fit into that strategy, that philosophy that I was talking about around diversification. So if we want to bring people into shopping centres for different reasons, we want to drive dwell time, drive footfall, drive a different experience, you have to bring in workspace, you have to bring in healthcare, education, that really delivers growth and ability for the secondary use, which is the retail piece as well. So the shopping centre component of Foundry was born out of how do you diversify a shopping centre? So the Foundry bit was about diversifying a shopping centre. But then the residential piece was about harnessing and delivering community from day one. So if you think about Wandsworth, where we're sitting today, this was opened midway through the flats and the build to rent component being occupied. So around 50%, 60% of it was occupied when Foundry came. Suddenly there was activation on the ground floor. The remaining 49 other activated ground floor spaces hadn't opened yet or haven't yet opened, and will be over the next 6 months. But Foundry was the catalyst to create that ground floor animation and activations. And it definitely brought the community together, not because it sold desks, not because it rented desks, but because there was run clubs, there was TED Talks, there was art classes, there was lots of different programmatic elements which engaged the residents, engaged the wider community, and essentially put this new pocket of city on the map. And Foundry did that because it was essentially trying to engage in the customers, of course, but it was trying to embed itself in the community. And from a Legal & General point of view, that was a real benefit for us, because suddenly it became a place brand. It became its own had its own identity in a way, even before we'd opened one shop, and that's now it's actually teed us up for the next 6 months where we're going to be opening these independent shops, and able to determine what the customer actually wants, have a narrative, a dialogue with the customer first and foremost.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You kindly showed me around before we do this. It's an amazing space, and everyone should come and have a look if they haven't already. And lots of people working in different settings, individuals, entrepreneurs, startups, up to kind of enterprise units. And I know you're personally yourself here at least a couple of days a week. You're kind of here as well as being in town, and so those kind of coffee machine moments here, the conversations that you pick up with people who are using the space, is there anything that kind of comes to mind about how they describe it as opposed to how you conceived it?
Yeah, so I guess unfortunately I'm not as close to the details. I wish I was. We've got a great team who operate these environments day to day, and I wish I was here 2 days a week. Unfortunately I'm not, but the one thing that we set out to do when we Adam Walter and myself and the team created Foundry was we wanted to create a workspace which was community, and I know it's an overused term, but community and program led first. It was again going back to that notion of the commoditization of space. If you think about retail got lost because of cookie cutter shops and high streets and hermetically sealed shopping centers. Offices, have a risk of all looking the same, suspended ceilings, the same kind of tiled floor, and quite cosmetic environments. How do you make a workspace where people really value working and connecting, really human? And you do that through a couple of things. You do that through really great customer service, like it feels like a hospitality approach rather than a real estate approach. You do that by having a true community program, and you'll see the team behind me who are completely embedded in that. And they're the ones that create those serendipitous moments where people connect. I've heard examples of people have co-working desks and that actually they realize their businesses align, so they go and rent an office between themselves and share the cost, and they grow together. You hear these stories quite frequently, and that's, I think, because of the design of creating public realm, which allows people to connect and network, but also the programmatic element of creating events which allow people to network and cross-fertilize ideas and deliver, I guess, local growth as well, which comes from the design, comes from the idea, and we're definitely seeing that come to fruition. You also got to remember that because of the diversification of geographies that Foundry sits in, the rhythms are completely different. You go from, the first one was in Eastbourne, seaside, relatively small seaside town. The second one was in Poole, which was in the heart of a shopping centre, extremely creative town, and very different rhythm, a lot more extracurricular stuff happening by the sea. Then you had Walthamstow, which had a very East London vibe. This one, Wandsworth, we're into today, is equally as different, but actually resonates a lot more like Poole, which is quite interesting. The latest one we've opened is in Hove. Again, very different vibe, very different rhythm. It's a slightly older demographic of user, which is quite interesting. So that changes the type of programming that we have there. And then the latest one, which is a completely different type of offer, is in Bromley in Southeast London, which is actually trying to reinvent maker space and workshop space within that enterprise sector. So because of the varying geographies, that also changes how people use the space. It isn't just about renting a desk or renting an office. That's the byproduct. It's about what you get as part of being the Foundry network, which is what people are really loving, and that's the stickiness, I think, that differentiates it from other operators, other environments that you want to work in.
Yeah, really interesting. And you mentioned there this idea about kind of local growth and neighbourhood and those terms which are very aligned with how we talk about places, and that for us, we talk about place growth, which is this kind of sort of idea of essentially kind of bottom up kind of growth of a neighbourhood that is partly related to what you do within your development or your operating business, but it's very much about the neighbourhood as it stands today, and it kind of its legacy that it's had, and then kind of its place looking forwards. And how can, as you say, how can that the local growth be something that the development benefits from, and the investors who own the development, but also, has a kind of a networking effect locally to create some local growth. So are there any kind of examples that come to mind of that, or learnings that you think you've had from kind of coming in maybe Wandsworth or Walthamstow or any of those other locations about that sort of knitting in with the neighbourhood?
Yeah, of course. I think because we're sitting in Wandsworth and Windsor Acres, it feels really prevalent to talk about this one, and it's a really exciting project actually. And we're talking about this now at literally the cusp of everything about to open over the next 3 to 4 months. So let me give some context and then talk about that question a bit more in detail with a particular project within this project that we did. So New Acres, Wandsworth, as I said, build to rent development, 1,000 flats, 30% affordable, and then we've got around 50,000 square foot of ground floor commercial. That includes 14,000 square foot of Foundry, which it's been open a year. That, I guess, is the Catalyst community hub, should we say, and that is around 70-80% occupied now. So we're way ahead of where we thought we would be. It's been a real success. And out of that 50,000 square foot, we've got roughly around 49 to 50 independent businesses opening over the next 3 to 4 months. So we believe this is probably one of the first new build developments completely dedicated to independent brands. For us, an independent brand is your first shop, your second shop, or a relocation. So, and it's really truly mixed. There's one exception. We have a Waitrose which opened today. That's the only exception that isn't an independent, but the remaining 48 others are independents. And in terms of the mix, you know, we've got essentially with Foundry 2 other anchors, let's call it. We've got a makers space, so makers labs, which is going to be 18 studios for makers and workshops and production. We've got 14 studios for wellness and practitioners. And then dotted around that, roughly 20 to 22 other boutique independent businesses. So that could be dog groomers, pottery studios, taco shacks. It could be a barbershop, hairdresser, a bookshop, a real village neighborhoodly feel. And then we've got a Sunday market, which will open every Sunday, a designer makers market, which will go through the public realm program that. And one brief that we set was that because we're creating a brand new neighborhood, and I guess my particular beef with new regen sites is this ability, one, to call it a destination because no one wants to live in a destination, but two, how do you design the rhythms so it never feels like either a ghost town or ridiculously busy? So these two spectrums of the places where no one wants to live, right? People want to visit there, but then leave. So our job is to make sure we have a constant hum. So what was really important for us is that the mix was right, so it's curated right, but also most brands had a programmatic component to them. So if you are an ice cream parlor, you have ice cream making classes. The pottery studio has pottery making classes. We've got events and poetry sessions and book signings in the bookshop. So you get the gist. The idea is that we'll have constantly different events and different things happening, which harness that community component. And we tested that, now it goes back to the question, we tested that before anything even opened with a pop-up that we called The Next, which was the New Acres experience. And that was in one of our shops just a bit further down from here. And that unit was about how do you create the physical manifestation of the New Acres experience before anything's opened and it's a building site. And how do you do that without calling it a marketing suite, basically, you know? And the what we decided to do was we essentially had a 2,000 square foot space. We split it up into 3 sections. The first section was what we called Cafe 404. It was run by a local resident who at the time I think was living in flat 404. And that was essentially the community hub. You can pick up a coffee, you can go and work there, you had free Wi-Fi, you had a meeting room if you wanted to use it. But don't forget, this was a building site and you had this space which was constantly lively and buzzing. There was a run club that happened weekly, I think, and comedy sessions and poetry. And that was curated in a really interesting way. Next then was the pre-Foundry. So you had free workspace for the residents, for the local community to come and use a pre-Foundry before this space was opened. And that was a real catalyst to put Foundry on the map in this local area. I think we opened this with around 20 to 25 pre-let because of that space. And then next to that, which was really excited about, is we did a collaboration with the Royal College of Art, which is a world-renowned design school, which is also based in not too far from here itself. And the Royal College of Art used that space to be a teaching space for architectural students, for sculpting master's students, alumni space, but they also used it as a way to embed the creative community in the heart of this. And that was really important for me. I guess as a creative, I really believe that we could set a trend here, that if we embedded a bunch of creative minds into this space, actually it will percolate and have a ripple effect to deliver some sort of culture that we wanted to retain. And that was for 1 year, that space. And we had a pop-up pub open, we had multiple events, we had sculpting classes happen. The sculpting group took waste from the building site here and created sculptures, which they then sold and exhibited. Once Foundry opened here, we bought a Reformer Pilates studio, which was going to open here to activate the space. So suddenly what happened was we had this space, which was beautifully designed, but it was a place that behaved a bit like a community cafe, acted as a workspace during the daytime, and then also embedded a creative community that people felt like they can go and be part of. And that was the catalyst for us to talk to the future customers, talk to the existing residents. We had a wall out where it said, tell us what you want in this space. It was truly customer curated. And I guess that was our take on how do you deliver something which doesn't feel like it's turning its back onto the existing fabric of the city, but also ensuring that it's future ready and it has the ability to remain relevant. So that, I guess, was our take on it, and it was a huge success. And we're going to build a partnership with the RCA and move them hopefully to the makerspace if we can. And we're gonna of course move Foundry over here, which we've done, and then build out the cafe community piece with other uses across the asset itself.
Oh, well, it's great. Great to fully appreciate all of that, as you say, because there's a huge amount in all of that, which is super valuable to the neighbourhood, but also to you as the owner operator. And what you've described there is something that is incredibly kind of iterative and maybe follows a number of different paths, and you don't necessarily quite know where it's going to go or control it. And it's led very much by people and the local businesses those independents that you described.
It's completely grassroots.
Yeah,
That's what that was the philosophy. The philosophy was, how do you make this from the ground up, as opposed to us telling how we curate this, how we activate this. It was very, very organic in that sense.
So then for you, and then so inside IM, did someone just put a load of trust in you to go and do this, or how did you kind of justify this? Because that's all, what you're doing is super grassroots, as you say, but you're also operating within a big, large entity. So how have you had to manage that process? Because I'm sure people would be interested in understanding how you go about turning these things from a kind of theory to practice, really.
Sure. So it takes time, and I'm very lucky that I've got a business that has huge amount of trust in what we're doing and why we're doing it. But obviously you have to prove the why. And it started as when we were in the retail space alone, when we delivered a street called Kingland in Poole, which therefore drove dwell time, drove footfall. It became very evident very quickly when we started doing these initiatives within the town centres, and they were working. They were driving diversification of income. They were driving dwell time, footfall. We were getting featured in articles, in titles like New York Times, in Vogue, in the Times, in lots of different titles that historically a shopping centre in the South Coast would never really been featured in. And we saw the customers were responding well. We saw that the occupiers really wanted to be part of this, and actually we were doing something quite interesting and different. But what became very evident as a business is that this was really relevant across our platform. So actually it became even more intrinsic in our residential strategy, because actually it was human-centric. It was completely people first. I have to caveat that we are legal in general. We have a long-term view. I think that's our superpower. We are about delivering value to our investors for the long term. An environment like this isn't about a quick exit. It's about making sure that we create sustainable long-term impact across the communities that we land in. So we have got that lens, right?
And that's massively important.
Yeah,
not to overlook that.
For sure. But therefore, our value metric is very different. Our value metric goes back to that holistic value that I was talking about. This is not about 2,000 square foot that we've activated for free. That 2,000 square foot has got this 49 shops fully let before we've even opened, because it was the North Star of where we wanted to get to, and people would walk into that space and go, I get what you're talking about. It's not just some fancy presentation from me saying this is what we're going to do and no one really believes us. So it expedites a lot of the vision and the strategy, because we're creating this stuff and people are touching and feeling it, and we're naturally seeing the value and the benefits, because we've got a really successful BTR component to this, which is where the majority of the value is, and therefore we're allowed to do stuff which is really interesting on the ground floor.
And then so whether it's you or whether it's colleagues, do you have a kind of a method of quantifying that value over the longer term? And is it as simple as kind of what all you're doing here kind of effectively just increases the underlying value of the BTR, and that is the investment case, or are you actually valuing what happened in these spaces or the ground floor in a special way?
So value can mean lots of. Are you talking? If you're talking about real estate,
that's I was thinking real estate.
If we're talking about real estate value, if you get the story right. So we also got to remember what we're playing with here, right? We had an asset here on the ground floor that when I inherited the plan had around 10 shops, had a very busy A road running through it, had a pretty hard line between, I guess, what was the busy street and us. and we had a pretty tough kind of barrier to the north side as well. So it wasn't a slam dunk, and what we try to do and what we're trying to do is to say that if you get the story right, if you create a narrative that is resonating with the existing community and the customers that you want to attract in and the residents upstairs, and you find the right partners to deliver this. By the way, we don't use retail agents. We use curators, designers, editors who talk the language of our brands. You're able to get and we split it into 50 activated spaces as opposed to 10, which we are now fully let in before we've even opened. So we're in legals in most of these units, and some of them are opening now. The value of that is that we are getting activation from day one. It's not rent from day one because they're rent free for the first year. It's turnover only for the second year. So we create packages which give the startups a leg up. But by year 3, once they're mature, actually we're seeing a fully activated, a fully let space on the ground floor that is on plan to what the real estate guys were putting together. If you really think about if we did this the traditional way, the majority of this would be vacant when it's opened. And we'll have a series of national brands that would come here that would look like every other space. And therefore we wouldn't differentiate our environment with anything else. And therefore would have a domino effect on retention, on place love, we call it, and have the ability to not have the story that people want to be part of. And I think that there is a direct value metric, which is we're going to be getting a series of successful brands paying their rent and hopefully staying, and therefore we're going to have a series of residents that are going to be really happy because they're living on a really activated, dynamic, exciting ground floor that is buzzing with energy. The risk to this is that sometimes you get startups that don't succeed, and sometimes we do expect churn, but if you get the story right, you've got a series of brands in the waiting list, which we have, who will be able to take that. And actually I don't mind that, because that is about evolution, that is about agility, that is about freshness, and that is really key for us. It's really important. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, no, really, really well. Absolutely. And I agree. Often the traditional way of doing it is to put a rent on, as you say, large units at the ground floor. That rent is often unachievable for the type of units and operators that you'd like to get in. So it becomes something that is always seen as a negative, or kind of the noose around the neck of a project, as opposed to what you're describing, which is a completely different approach, and a much better from an investment perspective, but also in creating better places and communities for people. So yeah, I think you summarised that brilliantly. And
could I just add on to that, Tom? Because that's the real estate value, right? There's also the other value, and I don't know what that's called, but it could be behavioral, it could be digital. But what we end up getting because of that is because we have a series of partners who are doing this with us, not for us, right? They're not tenants, they're doing this with us. We get all or most of the turnover data. We have the ability to track and measure all of the social media behavior and activity. We manage and work out what does customer behavior look like. And suddenly we've got a piece of insights that we have of a whole neighborhood that historically we would never have had. So we understand dwell time, footfall, spend, where our customers are going to visit in other parts of the borough, and when they're coming back. We can understand turnover. If this event happens and this turnover spikes on this shop, actually we know things are working, so we can manage trends and really understand what that flow looks like. So yes, there's a real estate value, but there's a whole layered piece underneath which we're managing and monitoring, which allows us to analyze the behavior of the asset, not just the physical data of the hard property data bits, which is invaluable. And that will therefore resonate with the strategy that we do with our residential strategy in the future, but also in other assets moving forward as well.
So Denz, you went to LSE, didn't you? The Cities program. I remember you telling me that in the past. And so if you took everything we've talked about today and you put that into your course there, or you gave a lecture on it, or it was part of the program, how do you think it would be thought about? Because you're now doing something which is real, it's on the ground, you're doing it in real constraints for real people. I'm curious to see kind of theory or practice from that perspective.
Yeah, we've really never had that question before. So yeah, I did do my masters at the LSE within the cities program. I definitely wasn't as smart as everyone else there, but what I did come away with from that year, which was the most insightful year of my life, actually, was I was really interested in how, what the creative class and the creative movement did to regen. And that was the catalyst to all of this, right? So the catalyst to all of this was, okay, if you look at pockets of city across the globe, it could be, but the ones closest to home, it could be Shoreditch, it could be Brockley, it could be Wynwood in Miami, it could be, I'm going blank now, but Kreuzberg in Berlin, certain pockets of city that were driven through the creative class movement, Richard Florida's thesis and theory. This idea that you kind of land a series of creatives into an environment that create an intrinsic culture that drive great food, great art, great music, around all of that allows, and then bring people in because people want to be next to that, people want to work next to that, people want to play next to that, people want to live next to that. That was the real catalyst to this. And when I wrote my thesis around God, you're sending me back now. So, I wrote my thesis around pop-up retail specifically, and how the ephemeral city really influenced the creative class movement, because you had really cheap warehousing that could be taken and activated and animated, and then bringing people into this part of the city that would never have been there. That writing about that and thinking about that alongside a course which was essentially sociology, really thinking about the social impacts of that, allowed me to merge those two worlds and begin to really think about what does that mean to place. We didn't really know it was called placemaking then for about 10, 12 years ago, and what the penny drop moment for me was actually the 2 years after that. The 2 years after that is when I went to a business called Appear Here. And Appear Here was, in its day, a platform that connected independent businesses and brands to vacant shops for meanwhile uses. And we were really lucky to work with the TfL for particularly Old Street Station. And we had, I can't remember now, 10 or 12 units that we had there that we could use for the pop-up spaces. And I remember after we redecorated and reinvigorated that station, and we had 10 shops and 2 market stores, I remember sitting there, and they were all activated and animated, and thinking, wow, if you've got a critical mass of space that is curated with the right mixes, and you've got footfall in front of you, or you can bring footfall there, that's placemaking. That's creating something which is interesting, different. But you need the critical mass. You need the right size of space. It's not about 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 square foot. It's probably about 500 square foot, 300 square foot. And you have the right content in front of the right people. Actually, you're onto something. And that was the penny drop moment. It was after, I guess, a couple of years of thesis writing and academia, then going into the commercial world. I never meant to go into real estate, right? It just happened. I genuinely thought I'd leave LSE and go back into design and be an urban design, essentially. And that was the penny drop moment where, and to this day, it's still me looking at a plan and going, right, we're going to cut these all up. Is there going to be the right size for this type of demographic? And we're going to create a place through layering programmatic components to it. We're going to go and find out what people want, and really going to deliver a package which helps those people make that happen. And in the long term, we're all going to see the rewards. The brand's going to do well. The landlord's going to be really happy because they create their place which is unique, different, and better than anywhere else. And the people that are around that, the existing communities, are hopefully going to love it because they're going to feel integrated. And that was, I guess, the learning of LSE, is making sure those stakeholders are all aligned.
Yeah.
I've really done disservice on my year at LSE.
Well, thank you for jogging your own memory, because I hadn't prepared that question at all, so it was very off the hoof. But I'm going to carry on that thread just for a second, because I'm really interested in it. And because it relates very much to what we've been doing at True Brewery, which is another kind of example of this kind of creative industries within the city. I'm curious, from your time there, the justification or the rationale for embedding creativity within cities. Like, do you have a feel for what that is more broadly to a city ecosystem, to a city economy, to the people in the place?
Wow, that's a good question. I think I'm slightly biased. I'm creative, right? And I've seen what having a series of creative businesses or creative communities come together, what that can do, and how creatives think about space, how creatives think about community. And it's not necessarily about the commerciality of it. If you just think about the bare basics of, you put a bunch of creatives in a space, you give them free space or whatever they do you give that space to them, they will create things which are incredible, unique and different, and then suddenly create place personality. And I've always been of the opinion that, I'll give you a real life example. I've always been of the opinion that as an owner, we are creating the platform for those people. We do not do that stuff. And it's really hard for me to say that as the creative. But so that the birth of Gather, which for example, which is our events program brand, was born out of my frustration in shopping centres where landlords had a marketing budget to run events, and you'd have some ginormous dinosaur run through a shopping centre and everyone thought that was great. And it cost 15, 20 grand, and we didn't really understand the value of that. And that would happen 4 times a year. And I'm going really back to basics here. And the fundamentals of that creative class movement were in this idea of Gather. And I said, right, what we'll do, instead of spending all that money in there, what we'll do is we'll take a space, we'll white box this space, we'll call it Gather because it's the place where we want people to gather. And we'll hire a community curator who is completely embedded within the local community. And that person will be the hub of bringing in the creative community to do stuff. And it was and it's completely free. And what that has ended up doing is driving footfall, driving dwell time, completely creating a domino effect of different types of creative moments. And that could be the launch of Kingdom, which was one of our first independent high streets. You put a bunch of creatives together. It's amazing what happens. You have great maker spaces, you have great events, great music, you have great artwork, and then their community comes together, and suddenly this ripple effect that happens, that you've got a real convergence of different types of people coming into a space. I mean, that's a real simple version of what we try to do, but it takes that philosophy on, right? It takes that philosophy on of creating free space, which can be overlaid with creative ideas, which then engages the community and therefore drives value to us as the landowner. Because you're bringing new people into a shopping centre or a residential environment that would never have overcome it. And suddenly it's on their social media, suddenly they're talking about it on their podcast, suddenly they're drawing it, or suddenly they're talking about it to their other friends. And that's what I think the power of creativeness gives to these kind of environments.
Yeah. I think you're also describing kind of a humanity there, aren't you, as well? It's kind of like that sort of human aspect of bringing people together, a gathering, and the kind of creativity and that comes from being together and being with others. And I think
it's a convergence of ideas, right?
Yeah,
that's the idea.
City. That's what cities kind of are in a sense, isn't it? It's kind of like these engines of connection, people and ideas and innovation. Go back to Jane Jacobs and other things. That was all the city as an engine, wasn't it? And yeah, I think that's really fascinating. And so you personally then, you obviously got a real passion for people and places and that intersection. You've studied it, work in it. Do you know why? Do you know what for you personally? Like, why did you get out of bed? Why did you do this?
That's a good one. One of my professors once said to me, right, being a designer isn't a job; it's a choice of life. It's you're living and breathing it, and it couldn't be truer. This job, I love what I do. I love the environment that I work in, the people that I work with, because it's in our DNA. Even if you don't know about it, it's in the DNA, because unfortunately my wife and child have to endure me dragging them to the latest launches or going to Columbia Road on a Sunday to check out the newest independents or what's going on in these latest cities, because you have to get inspiration at every moment. And it could be literally sitting down and going, okay, that's a really interesting way of outlining this table, designing this table or this wall or this countertop, because actually everything like that influences everything that we're seeing today, because it's what you live and breathe. So it's definitely not a job. I don't leave work at 5, 6, 7 o'clock and go, okay, now that's over. I'm gonna live my other life. It is completely ingrained in me. Why do I do it? Because, you know, it sounds super cheesy, but I think I really love creating stuff. I really love, and I know that thing that's been said before, like that, you know, having the ability to draw something, and that goes back to being a designer, you know, having the ability to draw something. The thing that excites me the most is selling it into the business. You know, going to the funds and trying to sell this idea in, or going to my line manager or the board and selling this idea in, and the why of doing it. And then the other layer of actually creating it and going, hey, look, we did it. That really buzzes me. That really engages me. And I think, yeah, that's something you can't really get rid of, really.
Amazing. And then, so just to end then, so at the moment you say you're taking your young daughter for a walk around Columbia Road. If in 20, 30 years she's taking you for a walk around some part of London,
I don't know. I don't think I'll.
what do you imagine that place to be like? What would it be like that in 20, 30 years time? You know, the work that we have done collectively over our careers and the impact you've had.
I can tell you what I hope it won't be like.
Won't be like.
Yeah, I hope it won't be full of screens.
Yeah.
And click and collect points, and AI robots welcome me into a shop. That's what I hope it's not, because I think where retail got lost a decade ago or longer is that it lost its human connection. And I think there's no doubt the online world is taking a big chunk of that, and I think that's totally fine. It's taking away the boring bit, the functional shopping bit. You know, go and get your black t-shirts in my case, or go and get your shampoo, or whatever else you need to do, and subscribe to Amazon and go and do that. But if you want experiences and you want moments that you want to share and talk about, I think that has to remain. So I hope it isn't just a complete digital sphere. But in 20 years time, someone will look back and go, what, old guy, old thinking guy saying that. But I think retail should always be authentic, and whatever that may be in the next 20 years, it has to remain authentic and organic.
Denz, thank you very much for your time today. It's been really, really fascinating conversation to learn more about the projects you're doing, your mindset, your approach. And I think there's a huge amount of alignment between how we think about things and our business as well. And it's been really, really good to dive into that. So thank you for your time.
Pleasure. Thanks for inviting me again. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Denz.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to the Grow Places podcast. For more information, visit growplaces.com and follow us at We Grow Places across all social channels. See you next time.